Ladies and gentlemen, it used to be the tradition of the State of the Union event that the State of the Union speech was given by a distinguished outside guest. And this year we have changed things a little bit, and we have decided that the main analysis on the State of the Union will be given by a different type of distinguished guest, one of our own, at the European University Institute. And it's my pleasure to invite Professor Brigid Laffan, the director of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute, to give the State of the Union address. Welcome, and welcome her.
Good afternoon. President, Your Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a privilege for me to address this distinguished audience on the state of what I call our unsettled union. I do so as director of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute, as a European citizen, and as someone who has taken public engagement on European issues very seriously indeed. As a citizen of Ireland, a country that has had more EU referendums than any other, I have voted 7 times on European treaties. I've participated in many lively debates on television, in print and on radio about Europe. I have stood outside supermarkets and football pitches, talking to individual voters, discussing the minutiae of European treaties and explaining why Europe matters. The lesson I take from my personal experience of these campaigns is that the case for Europe can be communicated politically, that voters can be persuaded to vote for Europe, but only if individual citizens are persuaded that the Union addresses their concerns and that they themselves are comfortable about making a political choice. This year, 2014, is a year of commemoration and recollection. 100 years since the outbreak of the First World War, 75 since the outbreak of the Second, 25 since the collapse of communism, and 10 since the Union's bold and successful enlargement to East Central Europe. 1914 is the most searing of reference years, for on August the 4th that year, in Fritz Stern's haunting words, the first calamity of the 20th century, the calamity from which all others sprang, was unleashed. The Europe of 1914 did not have powerful institutions to mediate large state powers, to foster shared interests among its peoples, nor contain conflict. A fragile balance of power succumbed in 37 short days to the vanities, miscalculations, and blunders of leaders and their generals. These reference years to pivotal years of the 20th century highlight for us that Europe's community, now union, was forged in the shadow of a very long European trauma. More recently, the welcome unfreezing of Europe's post-war divide in 1989 opened the way for a truly European Union on a continental scale. The taming of interstate relations and an openness to new members is the Union's unrivaled contribution to this continent and the wider world. I address you today in a year of transition and at a time of change for the European Union. The Union has experienced 2 major shocks over the last 6 years. First, the extended shock of the Great Recession, and more recently, the re-emergence of hard geopolitics to the east. It's not my intention to address the Ukraine and Russia in any detail, but the images of militias in balaclavas and military maneuvers on a European border remind us that interstate relations have been transformed in this part of Europe and that our union played a pivotal role in that transformation. The display of hard power we see are unimaginable within the Union. 2014 is a year of transition and renewal for European institutions. The European Parliament elections, in a few short weeks, are a key event in the political life of the EU. This time is different, we're told. The experiment of declaring Spitzenkandidaten undoubtedly adds political drama that will continue here this afternoon during the presidential debate among the candidates. We cannot judge yet what impact, if any, the Spitzenkandidaten will have on the future leadership of the Commission and, more importantly, on policy choice. The elections draw our attention to the political temperature in Europe. Turnout will be a crucial barometer of the attitudes and political engagement of our citizens 6 years after the outbreak of the global financial crisis. Low or declining turnout will undermine the Parliament's claim to representativeness. The eventual division of seats between the Christian Democrats and Socialists will count because these two parties continue to dominate the Parliament. The performance of Eurosceptic parties, both of the radical left and right, will be eagerly watched, and it is likely that these first truly transnational European elections will be a major success for EU-critical parties. The political complexion of the House will affect the legislative battles ahead and the leadership of the Commission. There's much we do not know. Will the Parliament coalesce around the candidate of the party with the largest number of seats? That is effectively behind either Jean-Claude Juncker or Martin Schulz. How will the European Council respond to the outcome of the elections? What coalitions will the Member States forge around which candidates in the intense post-election period? And how will the election of the Commission President play out with all those other roles that are up for grabs? Is the Union ready for this experiment? Neither the Parliament nor the European Council will want to trigger a constitutional crisis, but they may not be able to prevent it. We can anticipate fierce battles within the Parliament, within the European Council, and among the Member States about the new procedure and the distribution of roles. Once the votes are counted, a potent cocktail of national, party, and institutional politics will begin in earnest. We know with certainty that no one party will have a majority in the Parliament to elect the Commission President on its own. Thus, coalition politics will be the order of the day. If the radical left and right perform as well as we anticipate and can be anticipated, it is likely that a grand coalition will emerge, and that grand coalition will not just affect the election of the Commission President, but the legislative period ahead. One or more of the Spitzenkandidaten may survive to the endgame, or they may be replaced given the exigencies of member state and institutional politics. Whatever its final complexion, the new collective leadership will confront a crowded agenda. As the Union seeks to stabilise a weak recovery, move beyond crisis mode, and address intensifying external pressures. Of course, this is not just a year of transition, but it is also a time of transition. The Union has been tested perhaps like never before during the Eurozone crisis. Its legal framework, governance structures, its capacity to respond to pressing societal needs, and relations among the member states were all placed under very severe strain since 2009. The Union managed to battle through the acute phase of the crisis, but at a very high social, political, and economic cost. It's now in mending mode, but its troubled member states continue to face a legacy of hardship and debt, and taxpayers in the creditor countries feel exposed to the risks that they have taken in bailing and backing the currency. Both creditor and debtor states were caught in a vice-like grip by markets and their banking systems. The last 6 years has brought the chasm, and it truly is a chasm, between the world of the Brussels-Frankfurt Beltway and the domestic politics of the member states sharply into focus. The division of politics in the Union is exemplified by a striking resilience of the EU's policy-making system on the one hand, and the deep political and economic fissures across the member states on the other. At several stages during the acute phase of the crisis, it appeared as if the euro would implode, given the relentless pressure on individual member states and on the system as a whole. Implosion was averted because the Union's capacity, both political and its capacity to take decisions, was robust enough to prevent collapse. The governments of all euro states, both creditors and debtors, were forced to agree highly controversial and costly policy measures. The Council and ECB muddled through by addressing the urgent while attempting to build more robust institutions in the longer term. Crisis management and mending went hand in hand. The Union's legal and institutional frameworks were stretched but not broken. Summer 2012 was the turning point. Then, in an orchestrated way, a number of heads of government, including Chancellor Merkel and President Draghi, decided that it was time to send a consistent and credible signal to the markets. President Draghi made that decisive announcement that within our mandate, the ECB is willing to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. Financial actors began to accept that those responsible for the euro area would indeed do whatever it takes. That resilience that I have spoken about in the policy-making system masks very powerful centre-periphery dynamic that was and is at play. There is a deep fracture in the euro area and in the Union between the countries of the South and Ireland, an honorary member of Club Med, and the creditor states to the north. All economic indicators point to a fractured euro area. However, because unemployment and its consequences for individuals, families, and society is perhaps the most compelling indicator of all. At the end of 2013, the gap in average unemployment rates between the two best performing euro states, Austria and Germany, and the two worst, Greece and Spain, was 20%. And for youth unemployment, it was a staggering 50%. This is failure. Europe's youth in fiscally troubled countries are experiencing a level of mass unemployment which should not be an acceptable development in one of the world's richest continents. Fractures between states have been accompanied by fractures within countries because of the distributional consequences of the crisis. The effects of unemployment and welfare cuts on the vulnerable undermine a core European value, that is, a commitment to the well-being of all. Although achieving a rational macroeconomic policy in the Union is deeply problematic, mass unemployment and growing inequality should not be tolerated as a new normal. At issue is the question of whether the euro area will offer a return to prosperity for all, or just contain and constrain governments. Turning now to the dynamics that I can observe in the European Union, I have 4 propositions that I want to submit to you. These are analytic rather than normative propositions. The first proposition is that contestation about the European Union and politicization of the European Union is here to stay. Second, that the euro area Mark II implies more Europe. 3, that more Europe in turn implies greater differentiation. And 4, that the return to geopolitics puts the spotlight on the Union's role in 21st century world politics. Proposition 1. The enduring image I carry of this crisis are the coloured graphs of bond spreads that became the staple diet of primetime news. The mass austerity marches and European citizens burning the European flag because of its symbolism. The Union undoubtedly moved closer to its citizens as they learned what it was to share a single currency. Domestic crisis elections were marked by very high levels of voter volatility and incumbency losses as voters demanded hyper accountability. Since 2009, governments in almost all states have been defeated, and in some cases by historically high margins. And once mighty political parties have been brought low. The widespread punishment of incumbents offered a political opening to anti-system parties, enabling them to gain further traction with disaffected voters. Disaffection and protest has generated a politics of anti-politics in many of our states. The European elections are likely to confirm this trend. The polls suggest that Europeans will vote for populist, Eurosceptic and radical parties of both the left and the right in much larger numbers than in 2009. And there may be 3 political groupings to the right of the Christian Democrats in the next European Parliament. National political systems are under extraordinary stress across Europe, and national democracies struggle to respond to voter demands. Those political forces committed to maintaining and strengthening this union must begin to ask what weight democratic politics can bear, and how contestation in and about the EU can be politically managed so that it doesn't put more strain on the system than it can bear. Politicization might well lead to the collapse of the elite consensus on which the union rests. It may break apart, although unlikely. Or politicization may in time enhance legitimacy by furthering debate on the political and policy choices ahead. This depends on the agency of politicians and also on economic recovery. Politicians who aspire to govern in Europe today cannot insulate EU policymaking and the Brussels Beltway from open political debate any longer. Centrist political forces, both of the left and right, while maintaining their programmatic differences, must be willing to engage in robust argument about the successes, challenges, and yes, failures of the European Union. Nor should they overreact to the arrival in the European Parliament of more EU-critical forces. Not unexpectedly, the depth and duration of the crisis has affected public attitudes to the European Union, eroded public trust in its institutions, and undermined the value placed on membership. But this contested union also faces powerful pressures for more Europe within the euro area, and as the euro area continues to address its design faults. More Europe implies a more intrusive union in the member states and further centralization at European level. The member states are increasingly subject to more stringent surveillance, reinforced penalties, and constraint on national policy choice. The step change in economic governance has also gone hand in hand with deeper integration, notably the establishment of the banking union. And there will be demands for more centralization ahead. And that more Europe, by definition, implies yet more differentiation. Up to the 1990s, membership of the European Union implied agreement on a common constitutional and legal order, shared institutions based on common principles. Successive enlargements and diverse preferences among the member states have gradually led to more and more flexibility, and the euro area has been propelled into much deeper integration because of their mutual vulnerability. This has major implications for non-euro states. They are very sensitive to this as they seek to protect the unity of the Union's institutional system. The position of the United Kingdom is the most problematic of all. Europe is now one of the most salient and toxic issues in UK politics, and in David Cameron's Europe speech last January, he set out a roadmap of what he, as UK Prime Minister, would do if he was re-elected in 2015. His intentions are clear. He is committed to renegotiating the terms of UK membership, and if he wins the election, to renegotiate a settlement and offer an in-out referendum by the end of 2017. The British question would receive far more attention on the European agenda if this were normal times. The crisis, however, monopolised political energy and relegated the position of this large state to the margins. The other member states have indicated, while not making any concessions at this stage, that they are open at least to discussing the British question after the next British election. But all indications are that they're unlikely to offer major change, which in turn will make it much more difficult for Cameron to present an outcome as a new settlement. If those advocating exit prevail in the United Kingdom, there will then have to be a negotiation on divorce. Will it be EEA status like Norway, a bilateral status like Switzerland, or will the Union want to develop a new kind of privileged partnership for a number of large states on its borders, Turkey, the Ukraine, and then also perhaps the United Kingdom? This is not just a British issue, but an important challenge for Europe as a whole. It might be tempting to regard the departure of an uneasy partner with a certain amount of equanimity, especially as the Prime Minister introduced his demands when the EU was under extraordinary strain. But an EU-UK divorce would have, in my view, great dangers for the Union in the years ahead, not just because of the loss of the United Kingdom, but it would embolden anti-EU forces in all states and introduce a degree of contingency to the membership of every country. The UK would be a powerful reference point for those opposing integration in all states. This could destabilise the Union and transform differentiation into disintegration. Finally, the final proposition, the return to geopolitics and hard security. During its formative phase, the European Union was insulated from geopolitics because of the bipolar nature of the international system and the security blanket provided by NATO and Pax Americana. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent disintegration of the Soviet Union opened the way for the peaceful reunification of the continent, the Balkans aside, and for a peace dividend that freed Europeans to spend less on security and defence. All of these developments confirmed and reinforced the EU's self-understanding as an inward-looking, peace-loving power built on the deployment of soft power. Essentially, it allowed the EU to exist in a geopolitical bubble. The Arab Spring and its aftermath was a reminder of Europe's unstable neighbourhood, but events to the east are truly problematic. Clearly, the threat of war has not disappeared from our continent as Russia seeks to reassert its dominance in its near neighbourhood. And the issue at stake at the outbreak of events in Ukraine was an association agreement with the European Union. The European flag was flown in defiance of the Russian option by those protesters in Kiev. If the crisis cannot be de-escalated, then Europe will face some very tough choices about how much support it's willing to offer Ukraine, and also, I think, there will have to be more sanctions. The crisis certainly tells us that hard traditional geopolitics is back, hard security and high politics is back, and this will test Europe's capacity to look to its foreign policy interests and its capacity for action abroad. It certainly puts European energy policy high on the agenda and will provide an important impulse to reduce dependency on Russian oil and gas. So where is this transition taking us? For the foreseeable future, the state of our unsettled union will be transition. Indeed, transition or becoming is an important feature of the dynamic of integration. Thus, the response to the crisis exposed both a lot of continuity and some innovation. The four dynamics I spoke about, politicization, more policy integration, further flexibility, and a new consciousness of geopolitics, will all have a major impact on the next chapter of the Union's history. There is a profound tension in the Union between growing public contestation about Europe and deepening integration through technocratic policy solutions. Deeper integration, in turn, creates those tensions with non-Euro states, and the return of geopolitics highlights for us the tension between the economic interests of individual states and the threat to the European order emanating from Russia. The Union will not have the capacity to fully resolve these tensions. Political systems rarely do. Nonetheless, the challenge for Europe's collective leadership is to find ways of mediating them. And in my view, mediating and managing these tensions implies rebuilding trust and fashioning an adequate consensus for the medium term. Rebuilding trust implies that all member states, and here I speak both of creditors and debtors, take seriously their responsibility to each other, that in their domestic policies and practices they don't endanger the well-being of their partners. Rebuilding trust depends on ensuring that Europe's financial system is adequately regulated so that the public bailing of banks is a last, not a first resort. Rebuilding trust requires open public debate within the member states and across the Union about our shared problems, priorities and choices for the next decade. And rebuilding trust implies taking subsidiarity really seriously so that the member states and their peoples do not feel overly caged by the European Union. I end with a political message to those who will have responsibility for all of this in January next year. Some don'ts and some do's. First, don't. Do not be complacent. Now that the market stress has abated, it might be tempting to think that there has been sufficient retrofitting of the euro area. This is a mistake because there are very serious legacies left for the euro crisis. Second, do not be tempted by Big Bang treaty change. Many committed Europeans always think that one more treaty will solve all of Europe's problems. Given the experience of the Constitutional Treaty and the outcome of the 2005 referendums, asking the member states to negotiate a treaty at this fragile junction would, in my view, overburden domestic politics and provide Europe's populist parties with a very welcome political opportunity. 3, focus on the big questions. Europe faces many big issues, such as the search for a sustainable growth model, an energy policy, research and education, the future of our welfare systems, dealing with inequality and poverty, migration and changing demographics. We've got to stop in the European Union having sterile debates about the future of Europe. Put the big issues on the table and facilitate deliberation both within the Union and the Member States about the choices we face. 4, focus on the global. The euro crisis turned the Union inwards as so much political energy and capital went in to the rescue effort. Yet, as Europeans, we live in and struggle with a world of global politics. Every European issue has a global dimension, and this would be folly to ignore. Moreover, Europe has its responsibility to the globe and to the world out there, and it has its responsibility to building the necessary global governance in a multi-centred world. 5, bite the bullet on fiscal federalism. Economic governance can't rely on indicators and surveillance alone. We see from the dismal experience of the hard-hit countries over the last number of years that supply-side adjustment on its own simply is not enough. There is a need for some more fiscal capacity at European level, and I emphasise that that capacity should be limited. 6, recognise the trials and tribulations of reform. Many member states now face a decade of reform of their embedded practices and institutions. And it is precisely those countries where trust in Europe and in national government is weakest that most must be done. Reform cannot and will not be achieved by external diktat alone. Democratic politics simply will not bear it. Thus, in designing reform programmes, it is important that the Union develops incentives and, if necessary, lubricates the process with side payments. To end, if Robert Schuman were here today, what would he say about our unsettled Union? Shortly before he died in 1963, Schuman said that the hard lessons of history have taught me not to trust hurried improvisations or overly ambitious projects. Throughout its history, the European Union has attempted to steer a middle ground between improvisation and overly ambitious design. The crisis was inevitably, perhaps, dominated by hurried improvisation. Now it is time to move beyond this while keeping in mind Schuman's guidance on overly ambitious projects. We must remember that this union has been crafted by artisans, not architects. The union has achieved an enormous amount in just 60 short years, and we as Europeans should have the confidence to face and find a future that builds on our values, our institutions, our cultural heritage, and our creativity. Thank you.